How do you articulate how it feels to feel like you're being hunted and that your family members have a target on their backs?
Anti-Asian hate crimes in America increased over 73% in 2020. The same year, a global pandemic sourced to Wuhan, China, plagued the nation. As a whole, hate crimes rose only 13%, displaying a large disproportionality. A Stop AAPI hate report discovered over 9,081 anti-Asian incidents since the beginning of COVID-19. The highest amount of hate crimes reported to the Department of Justice were between the months of March and April 2020, during the time that California declared a state of emergency with the start of the spread of COVID-19 in the U.S. But the hate continues beyond that year. Physical assaults against Asian people rose from 10.8% to 16.6% between 2020 and 2021.
There's been a recent surge of anti-Asian hate crimes, and what is alarming is that largely against the elderly.
People express to us, allies even, how surprised they are that we're being targeted. I say to them, why can't you believe it? This has been happening for hundreds of years.
To understand the present and future of Asian discrimination, we must turn to the past of America. Chinese people were blamed for the declining wages and rocky economy and were hence declared ineligible for naturalization, and any immigration from China was suspended for a full 10 years. A decade later, the original act was extended 10 more years and further required all Chinese immigrants to carry their documentation with them at all times. While a new century dawned, discrimination against Asians had no cease. Osama versus United States maintained government's ability to deny Japanese immigrants citizenship. With World War II devastating the globe, Executive Order 9066 was promptly authorized, imprisoning over 100,000 people of all ages with Japanese heritage.
My parents and grandparents and most of my relatives were incarcerated by the U.S. government during World War II.
A century after the Chinese Exclusion Act, Chinese American Vincent Chin was beaten to death by two white men.
The two murderers never spent a day in jail.
COVID-19, that name gets further and further away from China as opposed to calling it the Chinese virus.
President Trump blamed the coronavirus on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. What did you think was going to happen?
We must hold accountable the nation which unleashed this plague onto the world, China.
Kung flu. Kung flu.
We continue our relentless effort to defeat the Chinese virus.
When our previous president started blaming the Chinese, I knew things were going to go badly, because I knew that, things would happen. Things always happen in these instances when ethnic minorities are blamed.
We need people at the top who are in leadership positions to be able to be realistic and tell the truth, right?
And so here we are, living in the age of a looming pandemic, with Asian countries and people used as a scapegoat to place the blame.
The second pandemic that we have faced is also a virus. It's a virus of racism that we have faced.
Asian discrimination is deeply embedded in American culture. It now lies in the hands of federal government and in your hands to address and eliminate our personal biases and to respect and protect each other.
To hit a little bit down the building around the 50th or 60th floor. Again, it struck flush into the south side of the South World Trade Center building.
Americans were devastated by the losses created by the international terrorist attack. 9/11 showed what Islamic terrorists could do, killing 2,996 people.
After 9/11, the Bush administration commissioned a series of reports, or they did this group called the 9/11 Commission. And they produced actually a really rigorous account of what went wrong.
And one of the main conclusions was that the different government agencies within the United States aren't talking to each other enough. And so DHS was established as sort of an umbrella organization to create better oversight and communication.
The DHS was also made to directly respond to the issues that led to 9/11.
In the wake of terrorist attacks, law enforcement and other agencies have a strong incentive to demonstrate to the citizens that they're responding to attacks.
New laws and security measures were put into place to make sure another atrocity like 9/11 would never happen again.
Airport security measures were directly responsive to certain kinds of attacks and attempted attacks by extremists in the post 9/11 period. There was this one incident where a chap tried to smuggle onto a plane, or succeeded in smuggling onto a plane, sticks of dynamite in his shoes. And so that was when, it was after that we all had to take off our shoes when we were going through airport security.
It wasn't only physical impacts that airport security had on the American people.
Terrorism has an oversized impact on people's lives in the sense that, by its very definition, it instills fear, it instills terror in the broader public. That in some ways DHS reduces fear, and in other ways it has the opposite effect. The DHS often releases bulletins, statements to the general public, which can actually have the opposite effect by stoking fear, by telling Americans that the terrorism threat appears to, be peaking, and that we need to be, on the lookout for all sorts of kinds of terrorists.
However, the Department of Homeland Security wasn't only taking a defensive position. The DHS also went on the hunt for terrorists, particularly in Muslim communities.
In the post 9/11 period, we focused probably too much on Islamist or jihadist extremism, and probably not enough on white supremacist or right-wing extremists. In the minds of many people, unfortunately, Islam as a faith became conflated with extremism. I think in the post 9/11 period, many Muslim communities in the United States felt as though they were being stigmatized.
A comparison of these two charts show that the areas with more prevalent and deadly terrorist attacks coincide with areas with anti-mosque incidents. This lets us assume that terrorist attacks cause anti-mosque incidents, leading us to believe that Americans think that terrorists are more commonly Muslim.
The experience of 9/11, I think, for Muslim communities in the United States was in many ways quite traumatic, in many ways impacted their civil liberties, and that, I think, was an unintended consequence of 9/11, and a regrettable one as well.
Even though the way law enforcement approached the prevention of another attack in a way that harmed Muslim communities and created mistrust in the American public, the DHS did have some successes in their mission to reduce terrorism.
But they have succeeded in doing one thing, which is preventing another 9/11.
20 years after the event, not only has the US government succeeded so far in preventing another 9/11 type attack, but the government has also created a balance in prevention of terrorism and still protecting its citizens' rights.
You might think efficacy means a stronger government response, that it's better to increase the number of laws in order to, catch the extremists. But actually, when you look around the world, some of the most incompetent government responses have been cases where the government actually overreacted to the threat. So I actually credit the United States government's response for maintaining its democratic character, its democratic values, without compromising, for example, free speech, even as it continues to prioritize the counterterrorism threat.
As the 20th anniversary of 9/11 passes by, Americans are thinking of the progress we have made, creating the DHS and implementing numerous security measures. But we still have more work to do in order to reduce the fear of terrorists and of Muslim people in America.
Welcome to Bethesda. In this Maryland suburb, 29% of homes cost over $1 million. Both its high schools are in top 15 in the state, and its downtown area is famous for its amenities. Skipping a neighborhood over to Silver Spring, we find less than 2% of homes cost over $1 million. The 6 high schools have an average rank of 62, and its residents are twice as likely to become a victim of crime than anywhere else in the state. Since everyone knows that some neighborhoods are better than others, why does this matter? Well, less than 14% of Bethesda residents are Black or Hispanic, but it is more than 44% in Silver Spring.
Even in a place like Montgomery County that are almost exclusively highly affluent, predominantly white, and you've got neighborhoods that are much less affluent, predominantly Hispanic, African American.
4 events in the history of federal housing policy explain why the same disparity exists between neighboring communities across America. When the Federal Housing Administration began insuring mortgages, neighborhoods with non-white residents were redlined as hazardous. Over its 30 years, only 2% of the loans from the National Mortgage Association went to non-whites. Congress funded the national highway system, but it cut through minority neighborhoods. So, while the Fair Housing Act outlawed housing discrimination, the historical loss of intergenerational wealth has had a permanent impact.
In fact, a statistic that we talk about a lot at the Urban Institute is that the homeownership rate for African Americans is actually less or just below what it was after the passage of the Fair Housing Act.
The late 20th century, it started to become clear that simply prohibiting formal discrimination was not going to be enough to reverse the patterns of socioeconomic as well as racial segregation that had been created by a long history of discriminatory practices.
The reason that Bethesda and Silver Spring remain segregated and minorities have such a hard time building housing wealth is that local governments have kept affordable housing out of wealthier white neighborhoods using exclusionary zoning laws, which only allow single-family homes and not duplexes or triplexes to be built in these neighborhoods.
If there is a zoning law, for example, a single-family zoning law, where a family cannot move into a home unless they can afford a single-family home, they are concentrated into what people may call quote-unquote ghetto or the hood, which then limits them and traps them.
In other words, the only way for many families to start building housing wealth is to first purchase a living unit in a duplex or triplex. But this only works if they can buy a home in a good neighborhood.
They should consider reforming some of these laws. Said it can add 25-30% of the cost of a home. That is very sizable, and it needlessly does price some people out of the marketplace.
But why should a teenager who lives in Bethesda care about exclusionary zoning?
As a teenager, you have to care about this because even if you're not thinking about buying a home, I'm sure you're thinking about where you want to go after high school. Exclusionary zoning makes it very expensive for you to be able to afford a good home, especially if you're going to have student loan debt after paying for college. So as a teenager, this fight is your fight just as much as it's my fight.
In 2020, overall hate crime numbers declined by 6% from 2019. For the Asian community, hate crime numbers skyrocketed by 145%. Activists in California acknowledged these rising numbers and began the Stop Asian Hate movement to raise awareness and address growing anti-Asian sentiment during the COVID-19 pandemic. The movement gained traction during the spring of 2021, when attacks against Asians gained attention on social and mainstream media. On May 20th, 2021, Congress passed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, a law dedicated to improving hate crime enforcement and incident reporting. While a bipartisan success, the federal legislation was limited in scope.
In my view, it is not an overly ambitious bill. What it does do are often the kinds of things that Congress can do quickly.
The law did have the benefit of national impact. Generally, the prosecution of hate crimes depends on local politics.
The way that you address an issue in cities where there are lots and lots of Asian Americans, the critical mass you already have there is going to present very differently from other pockets of the United States where you just have very few Asian Americans.
Even in cities with large Asian populations, the rate of hate crime prosecutions can be low. In New York City, the NYPD received 118 Asian hate crime reports by October 2021, but had only prosecuted one by that time, a Taiwanese man accused of writing anti-Chinese graffiti in Queens. One of the greatest barriers to prosecution is the difficulty in proving intent.
Hate crimes really go to the intent of the perpetrator.
Only if there's evidence of that intent that connote that racism, does that qualify those elements as that biased motive underpinning the hate crimes.
This lack of enforcement contributes to the underreporting of Asian hate crimes.
But across the board, what we see for all groups of color, no more than 50% feel comfortable reporting a hate crime to law enforcement. Sometimes they're afraid that their concerns won't be taken seriously and they won't get justice.
They also may not be able to take off work in order to go to different agencies or the court and have to repeat their story.
They don't want more publicity. And so when the newspapers come calling and the prosecutors come calling, they turn down those calls.
In 2021, the FBI received 8,052 reports of Asian hate crimes that had occurred in 2020, exhibiting a delay in reporting, and similar patterns were found in other reporting databases. Experts generally agree that education is essential to tackling racism against Asians.
Education dispels ignorance, so it behooves our students, K through 12, in colleges and universities, and also the teachers, faculty, and administrators to better understand that history and to integrate it into the mainstream curriculum.
And a lot of the education and a lot of the prevention just has to take place at a local and state level.
To truly combat racism against Asians in the United States, we need to continue educating and raising public awareness at a local, state, and national level.